Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. I'm your host Hena Zuberi and welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. On today's segment, we'll be discussing political prisoners, especially the case of Imam Jamil al-Amin. Imam Jamil al-Amin, formerly known as H. Rap Brown, was a civil rights leader and a humanitarian. He was convicted of a murder he did not commit in 2002. Upon that conviction, the community essentially abandoned him, except for a few group of dedicated activists and who have been dedicated to his cause. In the mainstream Muslim society, no tangible noise was ever made, and as such, his conviction and subsequent exile was gone unchecked. His son writes, the cruel and unusual punishment, the confession of another man, the medical neglect in hope that he dies, the gag order, the federal holding of a state prisoner away from his attorney and family. We have not done anything about anything. And because of our lack of action, much like the man himself, the truth about this case and his legacy have been erased from the public view. Today is people are celebrating the birthday of Malcolm X. And a lot of times we will see quotes on social media and people, celebrating that, which is great. However, there is silence on this case. So joining us for a discussion today will be our brother Al-Haj Mori Salakhan. He's a DC native based in the Metro Washington area. He's a human rights advocate, he's a writer, and a poet. He presently serves as the Director of Operations for the Afia Foundation, a Muslim-led grassroots human rights organization based in the nation's capital. Welcome, Brother Mori. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much, my sister. It is a pleasure to be on your show.
Alhamdulillah. We started this show just about a couple of weeks ago, and alhamdulillah, we've been talking about justice issues from various points of view. A majority of the times we discuss genocide and what is happening overseas, but we cannot ignore and continue to ignore what is happening right here in the United States. And you have been a voice for many, many years, shining light on the darkest corners of our country. And you have been active in police brutality work, anti-police brutality work for almost 30 years now. But aside from that, you shifted focus and have been concentrating on political prisoners. So tell me more about when you got involved in the work of political prisoners activism.
Wow. My first political imprisonment case, it was a different type of political imprisonment, but it was political imprisonment nevertheless. It was the politics of race, the politics of class, and the class in a double sense that brought me into the case of a young brother, young African-American, a non-Muslim by the name of Terrence Johnson back in the early, in the mid to late 80s. Terrence Johnson. It was the mid to late 80s. His case began actually in the late 70s. If I remember correctly, it was around 78. He was just a 15-year-old boy when he was brutalized by police in a Prince George's County police station. This was back when Prince George's County Police, its department, like the Philadelphia Police Department, took pride
Mm.
in being known as one of the most racist and brutal in the country. And a tragedy unfolded when Terrence and his brother ended up being taken to the station and brutalized in the case of Terrence because they considered him to be a bit flippant. He wasn't responding to questions the way, with the kind of respect, with the
Mm.
kind of because that they felt that they were entitled to, and the reason being is because they the detention of Terrence and his brother was based on a bogus scenario. Terrence was 15 years of age. His parents should have been contacted immediately. They weren't, but in the course of him being brutalized, he ended up getting his hands on one of the officer's guns who was brutalizing him, and he shot him.
Mm.
And a second officer ended up being shot and killed by friendly fire that night.
Mm.
And Terrence ended up, at a 15-year-old, ended up being charged with 2 counts of first degree murder. And if he had been successfully convicted of such, he would have ended up the youngest prisoner in the United States on death row.
Mm.
It was a case that really galvanized the entire greater Washington, D.C. community back in the day. It came to my attention years later
Okay.
when a petition drive. Terrence had been, by this time, he had already been imprisoned for almost a decade. And he had been a model prisoner. And he, after the fourth denial of, of, of bail, one of the African American newspapers, the Capital Spotlight, ran a petition drive on his behalf, and many thousands of people around the Washington area who knew about him, knew about the case. It resonated deeply with them. They signed petitions, and that is how his case came to my attention. The short of it is a brother who was at that time the president of the Black Student Union at UDC,
Mm-hmm.
and then an African American Muslim businessman who knew Terrence and his family. They approached me because we were doing at that time activism around Dawa related activism on Howard University's campus. So they approached me with the idea of forming a support committee for Terrence, and they asked me to chair it. And so that was the first case that I became involved in. In the early 90s, by the grace of Allah, we were able to win the release of that young man. And but then, within a few years, he committed suicide under tragic circumstances.
Mm.
But that was my entry into political imprisonment cases, the case of Terrence Johnson. And then there were a number of others I became involved in. Mumia Abu-Jamal, one of the most well-known political prisoners in the world, and a number of others. And then, leading up to Imam Jamil Abdullah al-Amin, and after the tragedy unfolded on the night before the Eid celebration in 2000, in March of 2000.
Mm. So, and I know you've been working on Sister Afia Siddiqui's case for many, many years as well. And
2009, yes.
2009, and the young sister from New York who was entrapped by in her MSA. I can't recall her name right now.
You're not referring to Adam Abba and Tashnuba Hyder, are you?
Yes,
The two
yes.
young.
Yes.
Adam Abba, yeah, she was. They were both 16 years of age. They were very young, and yeah, I mean, subhanallah, they came to the attention of the authorities simply because they were associated with a group out of New York. I think it was called the Islamic Thinker Society, if I remember correctly. They were, this was a small ragtag group of activists who used to, they were known for taking a bullhorn and going uh, out on the street and just, venting. They were venting, unbeknownst to, some of the members of that group. The government had installed at least one, possibly more than one, agent provocateurs within the group. And
Mhm.
anyway, the short of it was this young sister from Bangladesh who actually came to the United States in the arms of her mother and father as a young babe, and Tashnuba Haider and Adam Abba also, who came into the country as a young babe in the arms of her mother and father from Guinea, West Africa. They ended up being seized, and a lot of drama unfolded as a result.
Yeah. I remember Adama's story. It was made into a documentary too.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. Yeah.
And so let's talk about Imam Jamil al-Amin. That is why the focus of the show today. Um, we have, let's walk all the way back to that fateful day and start from there. Actually, let's tell us even more about him. Tell, for someone who may have never heard his name, doesn't know H. Rap Brown, who was he? What was he?
H. Rap Brown was a young firebrand who was part of the African American struggle for human rights. And in fact, when you said civil rights, I immediately I thought, I Imam Jamil, like El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. before he passed away, they were in truth human rights activists, which is a much bigger issue than civil rights. But Imam Jamil was a young activist in his early 20s, who was born and raised in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He followed his brother eventually to Washington, D.C. during a very uh, turbulent period in America's history. I consider the 1960s to be one of the most turbulent and significant decades in American history, and it's not it's not without consequence or significance that it was at 100 years away from another uh, uh, very important decade in American history, the 1860s, when the Civil War took place.
Mhm.
What happened here in America during the 1960s was a second Civil War. Um, and Imam Jamil was one of the most prominent personalities as H. Rap Brown in that civil that human rights struggle, that civil war that
Mhm.
uh, unfolded. Um, he was a young firebrand. He ended up attending Howard University. He followed his brother Ed Brown, who was also an activist, to Washington. He became part of a number of organizations on and off campus, but the most important organization that he is known for having been a part of, and in fact he led, following the leadership of Stokely Carmichael, who later became known as Kwame Ture, um, was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This was one of the major quote unquote civil rights organizations back in the day.
Mhm.
And it was an organization that was comprised of students, of university students, of high school students, and even a good number of elementary school students who were part of the pushback in the South, the front line of the struggle for African American human rights. But he was one of those very prominent figures. In fact, if you were to pick up a documentary
Mhm.
on what is euphemistically called the civil rights movement in America, at some point you will come across footage of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., of Floyd McKissick, of various other leaders of the big six civil rights organizations, the NAACP, CORE, et cetera, et cetera. You would come across footage of Stokely Carmichael, you would footage of Malcolm X, you would Elijah Muhammad, and you would also come across footage of H. Rap Brown. He was a firebrand, and in fact, it was probably, if not the most consequential leader of the of that young leader of that era. He was one of the most consequential in terms of students,
Mm,
student activism. That's who he was.
okay. And so he accepted Islam. And where was he in Imam?
Imam Jamil embraced Islam in prison, in Attica prison in 1971. Once he was paroled, he ended up moving to Atlanta, Georgia, and that's where he established the community mosque in Atlanta, Georgia, and he led a Jamaat that was not just national, but even had a couple of branches outside the United States at its height.
And so is he considered a political prisoner, and why?
Oh, absolutely. Imam Jamil is a political prisoner. You know, Sister Hannah, in preparation for this uh, presentation today, this interview, I picked up this old copy of a small booklet that we did on Imam Jamil way back after his case ended.
Mhm.
The book is titled, the booklet, it's roughly a 40-page booklet. It's titled The Case of Imam Jamil Abdullah al-Amin, Is It a Government Conspiracy? The
Mhm.
Case of. And this latest book that we expanded upon is titled The Imprisonment of Imam Jamil Abdullah al-Amin, H. Rap Brown, Is It a Government Conspiracy? But on the back of the booklet that we published after the trial ended, there are some quotes. Now, these quotes here from different folks, from Amnesty International, from the program director of Amnesty International, from the executive director of the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, from a resident, Miss Hattie Stegel,
Mhm.
bless her heart, 73 years old, from the West End community, and as well as a lifelong male resident of the community. They really speak to the political nature of this case and how people viewed Imam Jamil. Amnesty, the program director then, Susan Lee of Amnesty International America, said, quote, Amnesty International is concerned that anti-Islamic sentiment, while perhaps less evident than it was immediately following the 11th of September attacks, may still be running high enough to have the potential to jeopardize the fairness of a Jamil al-Amin trial, end quote. This is from
Mm.
Susan Lee. Steve Hawkins said, what happens in a country during wartime when all the hype is up? Right now, we have hundreds of Muslim brothers and sisters in detention without lawyers in this country. We have an attorney general, that was John Ashcroft then, who's trying to get broad sweeping powers now to paint the brush of terrorism and conspiracy to commit terrorism on all kinds of people. So you know that Jamil al-Amin has been under constant surveillance from the 1960s on. They
Mm.
tell us that COINTELPRO ended, but it never did, end quote. This is from the executive director of the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty back then. And then we have Miss Hattie Stegel, 73 years old, one of the lifelong residents of the West End. She said, I never saw him, referring to Imam Jamil, angry. I never saw him angry. When someone would die in my family, he would come by and offer his hand. And when the Muslim children would fight my grandchildren, he would make them come to me and apologize, end quote. And then we have this other lifelong resident, a male, who said, and as far as I'm concerned, he's innocent. This was a lifelong resident from Whitehall, Alabama, that I spoke to. Whitehall, Alabama, where Imam Jamil ended up being taken into custody after the tragedy that unfolded on the west end of Atlanta 4 days later. He
And
said,
you were doing this research for a book that you have written, right? Because we didn't talk about that a little
yeah,
bit.
This is from the back of the small booklet we did right after the trial ended.
Okay.
After the trial ended. Now we've done a book, a roughly 100 to 60 to 100 to 170 page book. It's a small but very substantive book on
Hmm.
Imam Jamil.
Okay.
And again, these quotes were just an indication of how political others outside of his Jamaat, outside of the Muslim community, have seen this case.
Hmm.
It is very political and has always been.
So, okay, so I'm going to take the audience back to the night of March 16, 2000. It was the day, it had been Eid that day for the West End Muslim community. Prayers were held by Imam Jamil al-Amin. And then police officers pulled up to the Imam's convenience store with a warrant for his arrest. And the police saw a man and asked him to put up his hands. And and they, when he did, that particular man pulled out a handgun, and a shootout between the man and two police officers ensued. And that man would go into his trunk and pull out a lightweight semi-automatic weapon. And using military grade weapons, this man would murder one police officer and injure others. And this man was.
James Santos, aka Otis Jackson. And this actually happened the night before the Eid. This was the night, the eve of Eid al-Adha,
Okay.
when this happened on March 16th, 2000. But yeah, they came to serve a warrant that was based upon a bogus foundation.
Mhm.
Ironically, a foundation that the authorities admitted was bogus.
Okay.
But the die was already cast. The damage was done. They came to issue that warrant. They ended up having this confrontation with Otis Jackson, as he describes it. Um, and the rest, as they say, is a very sordid and very disturbing history. Um,
Do you
one
think things
officer,
would
no, two
happen?
officers were shot. One died the following day. The other survived and misidentified Imam Jamil as the perpetrator.
Do you think things would have been different if Muslim organizations had been as vocal, perhaps, and as strong now as they are now, comparatively? Or do you think that they would have just ignored this case like many others are ignored?
There is no doubt in my mind whatsoever that if Muslim organizations, if prominent Muslim leaders um, across the board had responded the way that they could have responded and should have responded, things would have been quite different.
Mm.
We were tested, as we have been tested many times. We were tested back then when this happened to Imam Jamil, and unfortunately, as a community, we failed the test.
Mm.
And that is what allowed to happen what happened.
So he was charged for this crime. The confession didn't take place, and they didn't accept the confession. And so even eyewitness testimony was not accepted. The difference between a 6'5" Imam Jamil al-Amin and this 5'8", 170-pound Otis was not taken into account. So, and this is not the first time the authorities had been after Imam Jamil.
No, it wasn't the first time. In fact, again, the basis for the warrant that was served that night,
Mm-hmm.
night before the Eid, around 10 o'clock at night. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, just imagine a warrant being served the night before the Eid celebration. And I'm sure that the authorities were well enough informed about the Muslim community that they knew this major national holiday was about to take place the following day.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they served this warrant late at night, and the warrant was based upon a false premise. Imam Jamil, a few months earlier, had been arrested and charged with two offenses that ended up being found to have been unwarranted. One
Mm.
was he was driving a vehicle that the authorities initially thought was a stolen vehicle. It wasn't stolen. Imam
Mm.
Jamil produced papers to prove that that vehicle had been purchased by him, still had the dealer tags on it, and we believe that that stop wasn't about a suspicious vehicle that might have been stolen, but it was, we believe, in retrospect, that Imam Jamil had been profiled.
Mm.
So anyway, he was stopped, and then when they did the search on him, they found a badge in his wallet. So he was also charged with impersonating a police officer. Later, it was discovered, it was, I should say, proven, it was documented by the mayor of Whitehall, Alabama, where Imam Jamil has a tremendous amount of history, having, from the movement back in the day. This is an area that has tremendous civil rights or human rights history around it. The mayor, who was a part of that movement, along with Imam Jamil, told the authorities in a written document that Imam Jamil had accepted his invitation, the mayor's invitation, to be an auxiliary police officer of the township. And that's why he had the badge.
Oh.
So both of those charges were bogus, and
Mm.
and it should have been thrown out. What ended up happening, the day that Imam Jamil was supposed to appear in court, there was a freak ice storm that hit the region.
Mhm.
The proceedings for that day in the court were suspended. Imam Jamil, who was present, was told that there would not be any proceedings that day, and then either later that day or within days of that fateful determination, they had proceedings without Imam Jamil being notified. It was either later that day or maybe 2 or 3 days later, and he didn't receive notice. He was not present. Um, a bench warrant was issued for failure to appear.
Mm.
And and the rest, as they say, is tragic history. Months later, a warrant is served for that bench. A warrant is served on the night before the Eid celebration, and this tragedy unfolds. And
So
one
it's like they
officer,
were waiting for him. They were just waiting to
oh
get him
yeah, oh yeah,
somewhere, somehow. Why him? Why? I understand he was H. Rap Brown and he was a student leader, but at that time he had become an old imam, tending to his community and being kind to the kids. And why go after him then?
because COINTELPRO never died.
Mm.
The government's counterintelligence program never ended.
Tell us
Uh,
more about COINTELPRO. Some people might not even know what that means.
COINTELPRO. In fact, let me share with you specifically what COINTELPRO said. COINTELPRO, the purpose. Now, this is from a memo. This is from an updated memo, a formerly classified memo dated August 25th, 1967. The objectives, speaking about the objectives for the expansion of COINTELPRO, it said, quote, "The purpose of this new counterintelligence endeavor is to expose, disrupt, misdirect, or otherwise neutralize the activities of Black nationalists, hate-type organizations and groupings, their leadership, spokesmen, membership, and supporters, and to counter their propensity for violence and civil disorder." There's another passage that reads, and this is very important. It says, "No opportunity should be missed to exploit through counterintelligence techniques and organizational and personal conflicts of the leaderships of the targeted groups and where possible, an effort should be made to capitalize upon existing conflicts between competing black nationalist organizations. When an opportunity is apparent to disrupt or neutralize black nationalist hate type organizations through cooperation of established local news media contacts or through such contacts with sources available to the seat of government, in every instance, careful attention must be given to the proposal to ensure the targeted group is disrupted and not merely publicized.
Mm.
Consideration should be given to techniques to preclude violence-prone or rabble-rouser leaders and hate groups from spreading their philosophy publicly or through various mass communication media. Now, what's important to note here is that while some may hear language like this and think, okay, well, the government had a legitimate uh, uh, reason for targeting these groups,
Mm.
but you can be lulled into that type of thinking until you see the width and breadth of the individuals and groups, the organizations that were targeted. Everyone from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., someone who was committed to creative nonviolence, his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the NAACP, CORE, SNCC, all the way to the Black Panther Party, personalities like El Hajj Malik El Shabazz before he was assassinated, and also mentioned specifically H. Rap Brown.
Mm. So his connection to the Black Panther Party, all of that tied. It wasn't enough for him to be now a different persona, not a different person, not a different character, but there's a big difference between H. Rap Brown and Imam Jamil al-Amin, right? I hope that's not politically incorrect to say that, but if for someone who doesn't know anything about the case, it would be like, why are you targeting a man now? When, I mean, this is, I wanted to share some of his philosophy, and maybe this is the reason why he is the first American Muslim liberation theologist. Um, he writes, you know, the mission of a believer in Islam is totally different from coexisting or being part of the system. The prevailing morals are wrong. Western philosophy has reduced man to food, clothing, shelter, and the sex drive, which means he doesn't have a spirit. In Islam, we're not talking about getting the poor to vote. We're talking about empowering poor people with money. We're talking about overturning that whole thing. So essentially, and especially his book, The Revolution by the Book, which was published in 1994, this is something that it just, you know, he wrote about the centrality of prayer, charity, diet, pilgrimage, family, and struggle as the core elements of a person and by extension, social change. So he was a very dangerous person. He would his philosophy would have changed inner cities across the country. I want to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in the minds of those who want to maintain, those who have an interest in maintaining a very decadent, a very corrupt, a very oppressive status quo, yes, Imam Jamil was even more dangerous than H. Rap Brown. They were essentially, I mean, in terms of principles, there wasn't a whole lot of difference between H. Rap Brown and Imam Jamil al-Amin. In terms of principle, they were basically the same person, but in terms of approach, in terms of worldview, there was a world of difference between the two. And the Imam Jamil Abdullah al-Amin, the person that H. Rap Brown evolved into, ended up being viewed, and I believe rightfully so, by those, again, who are deeply invested in maintaining this decadent status quo. He was a very dangerous figure.
Yeah, because a woken person and a person who can wake other people up out of that state of decline that they're in, out of that, you know, and make them realize their obligations to God when, and then make them realize their obligations to society. That comes out, and and talking about God and revolution come in the
Hmm.
same sentence.
Yeah,
That is powerful. We
yeah,
know it's powerful,
yeah.
and they know it's powerful. And it takes somebody who especially when people listen to people who look like them, who've been through experiences like them. And so
Hmm.
this is definitely his. So tell me now, when so last May there was a retrial. Can you tell us
No, there was a hearing.
something?
There was a hearing in the appeals court, the 11th Circuit Appeals Court in Atlanta, Georgia,
Mhm.
to determine whether or not Imam Jamil should and would get a new trial.
Okay.
Unfortunately, and I was in Atlanta for that, for the arguments that day before this three-judge panel. The arguments in Imam Jamil's favor went so well that I almost felt sorry for the attorney that had to argue against the motion for a new trial. I
Mhm.
almost felt sorry for her. She just the argumentation was so overwhelmingly in Imam Jamil's favor. It was clear violations had taken place. He did not get a fair trial. But unfortunately, at the end of the day, when the when that panel made their decision, while acknowledging that his rights were violated, his constitutional rights were violated during the trial, they nevertheless determined that the violation wasn't so great that he should be entitled to a new trial. And so, it went from there to the U.S. Supreme Court, and just recently, maybe 2 months ago, I guess, uh, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear arguments in the case of Imam Jamil, and so the legal side of the struggle continues. But what is even more important is what happens outside of the courts, what happens outside of the judiciary. I've said for many years, Sister Henna, that when it comes to political prisoners, whether those political prisoners are Muslim or non-Muslim, the judiciary is not the place to look for relief.
Hmm.
You
Talk about
know,
that a little bit more. Let's. I'm gonna pinpoint a little something to you, because I see we have some new listeners. What is a political prisoner?
a political prisoner is someone who, well, traditionally, political prisoners were viewed as prisoners that were targeted by governments that were out of control, and they were targeted for their political beliefs and activities.
Mm.
All right. This is what the traditional view of a political prisoner is. Political prisoners, uh, for us, have greatly expanded over the past 2+ decades. Well, especially, well, not just since 9/11, even before 9/11. Um, we saw the handwriting on the wall before the tragedy of 9/11 that this time was coming when there would be a new crop of political prisoners that would be minted in the United States of America, the land that likes to call itself the land of liberty and justice for all. A
Mm.
new crop would come out of the pipeline, and this new crop would be disproportionately Muslim because
Mm.
of the way that Islam and Muslims began to be targeted after the fall, the collapse of the former Soviet Union. For many decades, you had this struggle, this bipolarity struggle between the United States and the former USSR,
Mm.
and it went on until the collapse of the Soviet Union. That was in large part brought about because of their occupation of Afghanistan, and we know how that ended. They were booted out with the support, ironically, of the United States. And that's back in the day when the Taliban were viewed as freedom fighters. And but we saw the handwriting on the wall that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there had to be a new justification for the ever expanding military industrial complex, which has been added to by a national security complex.
Mhm.
And what was used to justify that expansion was the rise of militant Islam.
Mhm.
And so, we saw the handwriting on the wall, and we saw that, you know, um, prior to 9/11, and then especially after 9/11, there would be a new generation of political prisoners, disproportionately Muslim. These are prisoners of the politics of bigotry, the politics of ethnicity, because the vast majority of Muslims who are targeted are non-white,
Mhm.
um, and non-white, non-European, and it would also be based upon religion. And so you have this mix, you have this mix in this pot of political imprisonment stew
Mhm.
that has produced this new crop of political prisoners.
So
And
now you're saying, now to go back to what you were saying that for political prisoners, you do not believe the court system it doesn't work, or that is not the route to fight for this.
no, it is. An- uh, let me respond to your question with another quote from for the late. I had so much respect for this man, and I'm sure that anyone from New York City who is connected to struggle will, sit up and take note when they hear the name Bruce Wright, former U.S. I mean, I'm not U.S., but former New York State Supreme Court Justice Bruce Wright. He was an African American outlier. He was a very outspoken um, champion for justice. He said, quote, in his book entitled Black Robes, White Justice,
Mhm.
he said, the inability of an African American or any other person of color to get a fair trial in America is a national scandal. All of us must never forget the loving injunction of Frederick Douglass in his last will and testament to agitate, agitate, agitate. This comes from then, when he made this observation, a retired New York State Supreme Court justice. And this is a reflection of why my position is and has been what it is. Political prisoners will not get justice in the courts just relying upon the judiciary itself. It's not going to happen. We have history, a long history to show that this does not happen. What is required is activism out here in the court of public opinion. That is what has to happen in order to secure justice for political prisoners.
Mm. So, okay, let's talk about specifically about Imam Jamil Amin's case. So, what would you like to see now? What sort of activism? Because a lot of times people think, oh, I'll sign this petition and I'm done, right?
Right.
Or I'm it's say basically, oh, I'll make dua at home, or or it'll be just these small groups of people who might meet in a church basement or a mosque or and have this really in-depth discussion and talk, it's an echo chamber and they're just talking to each other and that's it. and and then years pass. What would you like to see change? What do you think are some current strategies that people can do and should do?
The first thing I would strongly suggest, strongly recommend, is for people to educate themselves on who Imam Jamil Abdullah al-Amin is. Information is power. Information is power, and that's the reason why we put out this little booklet on Imam Jamil after the case ended in 2002 to make sure that his struggle would not be forgotten, and that's the reason why we are in the process of publishing this latest book
Mhm.
on Imam Jamil, the imprisonment of Imam Jamil Abdul Al-Amin, H. Rap Brown. Is it a government conspiracy? To take this education process to another level. Um, First of all, we have to educate ourselves
Okay.
so that
So
we know who this
I'm
imam is.
going to I know I shouldn't be interrupting you so much, but I'm going to interrupt you because I think you're going to like this interruption, because this will educate some people about who he is, not
Hmm.
who he was, but who he is. So this is his Ramadan message, and I'm going to read this to you. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Compassionate. May 2020, Ramadan 1441. Blessed are those who struggle. Oppression is worse than the grave. It is better to die for a noble cause than to live and die a slave. There are no new answers to old problems. Tyranny and oppression is worse than slaughter. So fight them wherever you may find them. Common struggle is not sufficient. We have to begin to be conscious in our struggle. Allah does not change the condition of the people until they change what is within themselves. Say the truth has arrived, and falsehood neither creates anything new nor restores anything. He quotes the Quran. Truth smashes the brains out of falsehood. Truth comes and falsehood is vanquished. For falsehood, by its nature, is bound to perish. Then he goes on to say, we live in a land that has said that freedom is the pinnacle of its moral argument, that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, its banner of moral authority, that there's free speech, but I'm still gagged and prevented from declaring my innocence. They speak to me of religious freedom, but I'm not allowed to pray according to my faith. Like the Panther 21, incarcerated unjustly to discredit a movement, like those Panthers still behind bars after decades. There is no freedom, and morality for those in power remain a myth. They say they guarantee liberty, but not for the ex slave and the Native American. Their pursuit of happiness is always at the expense of the poor. Can you see? Justice and law march to two different drummers, two totally different conversations. Now the rights you thought you had will be taken away. Huey P. Long, a former governor of Louisiana, was asked, will fascism come to America? He replied, yes, but it will be called patriotism. Shepherds may change, but sheep will always remain the same. Then he goes on to say, empires rise and fall, worldly powers can do and do defy right, and misused intelligence may obstruct Allah's light, but Allah in His good time separates good from evil. I believe both by certain faith and by intuition that there is no power and no might
Hmm.
except with Allah, the High and the Mighty. And He leaves us with a prayer, Subhanallah, and He wishes everybody Ramadan Kareem. So this is
That's
Imam.
vintage Imam Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin. That's vintage Imam Jamil. Yes, indeed.
Subhanallah.
Yeah.
So, so okay, we educate people about him.
That's one, and then we have to become active. One of the I would encourage brothers and sisters, if there is an Imam Jamil Action Network group within your area, within your city, or within your state, try to connect with them. Um, the Imam Jamil Action Network is a network of some active brothers and sisters, Muslim and non-Muslim, who are committed to doing whatever they can to keep the struggle for Imam Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin alive, and to make it stronger. That's one. That's the second thing you can do. The third thing, uh, Kyrie, the youngest son of Imam Jamil and Sister Karima, they have two sons. The youngest one, who followed in his mother's footsteps and became a practicing attorney himself, he has taken a very prominent role in the campaign for his father. Alhamdulillah. He established this website that if you haven't been to it, this is a website you need to go to on a regular basis. What happened to the number two, rap.com. What happened to the number two, rap.com. You can go there. There's a wealth of information there. You can see how you can support the work that Brother Kyrie is doing on behalf of his father. And also, I would encourage you, there's a video right now of online at this website, and some of you have seen it shared in social media. This video of Otis Jackson, of James Santos, aka Otis Jackson, on in a trial, being cross-examined, and in a way that surprised the prosecutor to the extent that he ended up being so thrown off that he had to call for a recess. He had to ask for a recess. But in this very short bit of cross-examination testimony, he goes into what happened on that night and what he did. The fact that he was the one that got into the gunfight. It's very provocative video, and so I would encourage you to watch that, share it with others, and then also sign the petition. But as our sister has said, as Sister Hannah has said, my problem with petitions, and I want you to sign this petition, I want you to share this petition, because petitions do count, they do matter. But don't allow a signature, your signature on a petition, to lull you into the belief that you've done enough, because you haven't. That's just the beginning. That's the start. That's the least we can do. I mean, there are others who will argue, well, the least I can do is I can make dua. But for those who say, I'm going to make dua for this political prisoner or for that political prisoner, subhanallah, let me advise you what, in the words of our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what the Prophet said about dua that is void of action when action is possible. The Prophet, peace be upon him, is reported to have said, by the one in whose hand rests my soul, you must surely enjoin the good and forbid the evil. Otherwise, it is expected that Allah will send against you a punishment like COVID-19, and you will supplicate him, but your supplications will not be answered.
And this is a point that you just made. I want to highlight that this is not just about Imam Jamil al-Amin.
That's right.
When you join the Net Action Network, you're not just joining. It might be named after him, but it is for the hundreds and thousands of Imam Jamil al-Amins that are languishing in prisons, in our cities, who are, that could be them, right? Like we talked about this yesterday as well, is that we don't know how many Malcolm X's are in prisons right now, or have left the prisons, and we have just kicked them out of our communities. So we don't know which potential, and we don't want any more of them, right? We don't want them to start coming after our Imam Ali's and our, like they came after, our dear Imam from New York. My brain is a minute slow. I can't remember his name, but they came after his kids, so they're coming after imams left and right. They and even people who are not imams. But so this movement is much more than just about one person, even though releasing him is a highest priority. But it is about so much more. And, this is why you established Afia Foundation, because you believe in that it's not just about Afia, it's about everything else that that comes with that, because when one person is terrorized and when one person is unjustly put behind bars, then you're saying it's okay to put our community behind bars.
That's right. When your silence, that when it comes to issues like this, there is no neutral ground. You can't be neutral. You can't be indifferent. You can't say, you know, uh, this is political and I'm not going to be involved. I'm just going to pray and subhanallah, the prophets. First of all, Allah Ta'ala has said in the Quran, in the translation of the meaning, stand firmly for justice as witnesses to Allah, even if it be against yourselves. We are required to stand firmly for justice. And the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, he said, when you see an evil action, you must change it with your hand. If you cannot do so with your tongue, if you cannot do so, detest it within your heart, and that is the weakest degree of faith. He also said, one of the greatest jihads is to speak truth to a government, to a caliph, to a governing authority that is deviated from the right way. And this is something that we can do in America. We can do this in parts of Europe, in Britain, in France. We can do this. There are places in the world where, you know, they can't. They can't raise that. To raise their voice in the public square can be a death penalty immediately. We can do this, and we don't. We muzzle ourselves. And this is what really troubles my heart, because in muzzling ourselves when we have the capacity to do, and especially some of our prominent leaders and activists and organizations who cherry pick which issues I'm going to give my attention to and which I'm going to stay away from because it might ruffle the feathers too much of the powers that be. We can't be this way. Every one of these types of cases is a litmus test for us as Muslims. We either uh, we either pass the test or we fail the test.
True.
And if we fail, we pay a price. We all pay a price, whether we realize it or not. We all pay a price.
As we're wrapping up, tell us how we can buy the book. Do you have a copy? If you could show us. And
This is it.
mashallah. Mabruk on the book.
MashaAllah, ta'ala. Yeah, this is it. Um, Folks they can go to our humble website, afia.org, aafia.org, and go to PayPal and make a donation. Now, let me say, for the balance of the month of Ramadan, we're offering an incentive that those who purchase a book either online or they can put a check or money order in the mail, for a donation of any amount, we will send you a copy of the book when it comes out. A personalized copy of the book when it comes out. But we want to encourage you to give as much as you can according to your means, because it's not just about purchasing a book. It's about helping to finance a movement, a human rights movement. This is what the Afia Foundation represents. This is what the Coalition for Civil Freedoms represents, a movement on behalf of political prisoners and their families, as well as in the case of the Afia Foundation, addressing other issues, justice-related issues across the board. This is how you can help us. And this is one of the most meritorious forms of zakat or sadaqah you can give. Once the book is officially published, hopefully by the end of this week, it will be available online for purchase for $15 a copy, plus whatever the mailing cost is for it to be purchased on Amazon's website. This is going to be the platform that it will be available on. But for the remaining days, we're just asking you to donate what you can, as much as you can, to help us with this very important work.
Well, thank you so much, Brother Mori, for being here, for being a part of the show, and for writing this. I know, someone like you who would take those 2 months in under the pandemic and actually turn it into a book. Unlike the rest of
Alhamdulillah.
us who just think about writing them and but not actually get down and sit down and put the pen to the paper. So thank you so much, Jazakallah khair. May Allah bless your work and continue to give you good health. And
Ameen.
thank you so
Ameen.
much for being here.
And,
Um,
and and you, sister, may Allah Ta'ala continue to bless you and protect you. You are what I consider to be one of the rare gems within our community. I'm so proud of you. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to continue to bless you in your work, and we ask Allah to bless us, given the fact that our sister Henna is a board member of the Afia Foundation, but she doesn't her energies and time and what have you is deeply taken up with many other issues, and we're hoping that maybe once this pandemic lessens a bit, and we're in a better situation, that we can gain a little bit more of our sister's expertise in helping us develop this organization to the capacity that it needs to be at. But we are very, very proud of you, Sister Hannah. If this old man sitting in front of you were to have what was to be blessed with another child, and it was a female or a male child, I would want that child to be like my sister Hannah. MashaAllah. May Allah bless you.
Exactly, khair. Thank you so much, Jazakallah khair, for those kind words. And with that, I want to invite you all. We are going to be doing our Ramadan telethon tonight, 10 o'clock. We will have be making a dhikr. We'll be reciting Quran and making dua for all the oppressed that we work for, the Rohingya, the Uyghurs, Muslims in India, Muslims in Kashmir, and all other Muslim minorities oppressed around the world. So, inshallah, join us tonight, 10 p.m. We will be on Muslim Network TV, we'll be on Facebook Live, and on YouTube Live. So, I hope to see you all along with Buna Muhammad, um, Brother Eddie from the Dean Show, Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid, Imam Taha Ghayur, Sister Aideen Anwar, Zahir Adel, and myself will be hosting it tonight. So see you tonight. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.